the first step, the first thing that you need to do after you've gotten past the moment of, I could actually sell, I could actually make some money from my MSP practice. The first thing you really have to address is, what does this buyer really want from me? And I'll tell you this, there are many different buyers wanting very different things. And you kind of have to ask them sooner rather than later, what is it that you want? Now, I'll give you a couple of really good examples. In recent years, I'd really say in the last decade or so, there have been some fantastic options when it comes to private equity backed models for MSP succession planning. There has never been a time like today where there has been more opportunity for managed service providers when it comes to exit strategies. And that's saying a lot, given that for 3 or 4 decades, we've always had mergers and acquisitions activity. It's been the lifeblood of the MSP sector, as it is in many other industries. But we've never really seen the type of diversity, the level of interest in MSPs globally like we have today. And that presents an enormous array of opportunities and options for MSP business owners and investors or owners in a company, whether you're an operator or just a passive investor. That's the good news. The bad news is there's a lot, unfortunately, of bad options. And what I'm hoping to do is to present a current landscape review of what MSPs are today, mid-year through 2025, looking at when it comes to their options to have a type of succession plan. And there's going to be a lot of different options and variables that we present and talk about today. Some of them may apply to you. Maybe they don't apply to you, but at least you'll have a better sense at the end of this episode of really what you have in front of you in terms of your exit strategy option, if and when you ever come to that moment. Some of you may have already had that moment come and pass. Some of you may be just approaching it. You may be in the middle of it right now. This is going to be for everybody who's thinking about or wondering about, what do I do when I want to have a succession plan? So let's dive right in. So first of all, what do we talk about? What do we mean when we say a succession plan? That could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I'll just boil it down to its most simplest form. A succession plan, as I'm talking about, is a managed service provider, let's say a single owner, right? One individual who owns 100% of their MSP business, and they want to sell. Or maybe someone comes to them and says, hey, would you like to sell? Right? We've done a lot of studying and advisory work over the years about the different pros and cons to timing your exit strategy versus you responding to someone coming to you and saying, hey, are you interested in selling? Right? Because there are different power dynamics at play here that you have to be aware of. But let's say you're just a single proprietor. You own your own MSP, you own it outright, and you're interested in selling. You're interested in a liquidity event of some sort. Well, that could come in many different forms, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of them right now. You have different buyers, different investors, and they all present different motives and different things that they want to do with your company. The first step, the first thing that you need to do after you've gotten past the moment of, I could actually sell, I could actually make some money from my MSP practice. The first thing you really have to address is, what does this buyer really want from me? And I'll tell you this, there are many different buyers wanting very different things. And you kind of have to ask them sooner rather than later, what is it that you want? Now, I'll give you a couple of really good examples. In recent years, I'd really say in the last decade or so, there have been some fantastic options when it comes to private equity backed models for MSP succession planning. You may have heard of groups like Evergreen and New Charter and a few others out there. They have been doing really solid work that, generically speaking, give MSPs the option to either stay after the deal is done or to completely leave. And now, both of those groups that I mentioned and a few others, they may have their own rules and their own preferences of what they would like, but they generally speaking afford those types of options. Other investors, other buyers might be a little bit more rigid about what they want from you. They might say, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable with you leaving that quickly. I'd like you to stay just to make sure that everything is stable and the business, the customers, the employees all are settled and sticking around post closing, because that's going to matter obviously very much to a buyer. They just spent probably a lot of money buying your company. They don't want customers, employees to walk out the door. Makes sense, right? But you're dealing with many other types of buyers and investors out there. The private equity community right now and for several years now, and it's not showing any signs of slacking. The private equity community is all in managed services. I have yet to see a managed service provider, private equity firm that isn't coming out of the woodwork almost on a weekly basis saying, you know what, we want to be in this managed services game. We want to invest in and own MSP businesses. And that may sound like a good thing because it is, but you have to take that with a grain of salt, because the MSP PE firms that I mentioned earlier, who have done dozens of deals, they know MSPs, they own dozens of MSP businesses, and they have a really good handle on managed service providers in general. They are the minority. There are far more private equity firms, some venture capital firms as well, and other types of investor groups who don't know much about managed services. They might think that they do, but they don't really. And some who actually admit they don't know much about managed services. But that's not stopping them from buying and approaching MSPs and saying, hey, would you want to sell? Now, you may be saying, well, Charles, what's wrong with that? Why wouldn't that be a good thing? It's not a bad thing per se, but if you're dealing with an inexperienced private equity company, and they approach your MSP shop and they say, hey, would you like to engage in conversations, negotiations with us to buy your MSP practice? And there's some things that you would want to know. I'll list a few of them right now. Do they have money? You're wondering, why did I bring up money? They're a private equity firm. Of course they're going to have money. Not so fast. Private equity firms, yes, generally do have funds. Some private equity firms are in between funds, meaning they have a period where they cash out some of their investors and they're going out to new investors to get them to invest. Right? There's always a period of ebb and flow in any private equity firm. And that's not even talking about deal size, right? You may be a deal size for that PE firm that is below their level, where they may say, you know what, we're really interested in you, but we're going to borrow the money. We're going to borrow the money not from our investors, but from a bank. Very, very common model for a lot of PE firms who want to, kind of apply a standardized model of acquisition that is more of a leveraged buyout and not putting all of their investor funds at risk for any one particular deal. So I digress, but you do have to ask, and you should, in your own due diligence for any buyer, particularly a PE firm, you should ask them, let's see the money. Let's see that you have money and the capability to do this type of a deal. Now, you may be saying, well, how much money should I be asking for? We'll talk about valuation in a moment. But once you figure out a general range of what you would be willing to accept for your MSP practice, you need to find out from your PE firm, do they have the ability to do a deal or don't they? There are, and again, part of that due diligence is not just do they have the money. The next question would be, what do you want from my company? Do you want to do a roll up? If so, what type of a roll up are you talking about? Are you wanting to buy a whole bunch of MSPs and plug us into one single MSP? Do you want to buy a whole bunch of MSPs and just allow us all to operate under our own brand and under our own processes? Those are very, very different concepts and different models. And you have a right to know what they intend. And if they can't tell you or they don't tell you, That's a red flag in my book. That's a big red flag because it either tells me that they don't know what they're doing and they're trying to figure this out, or for whatever reason, they don't want to tell you, which why don't they want to tell you? If it's your customers, your employees, and most MSP business owners I know, they care deeply about their employees, their staff, and their customers, and they don't want anything bad to happen to them. And so, you're probably going to be a little bit circumspect about people who pretend to say, I'm going to buy you, but they don't actually either have the funds or they're not really able to articulate what they want to do. Which brings me to a kind of a third investor type or category, and that's the search fund. And we've talked about this in previous episodes. I've written about it, talked a lot about it at MSP World in many past years. These search funds are people who are looking for deals to match up to money they're going to go find later. That sounds weird, sure, but basically what they're saying is we have an idea of where to go get some money, but we need to go find a deal first. We're going to go find this deal, package the deal up, and then go and seek funding, right? So think of it in terms of a house. It would be like you're going house hunting before you've actually gotten to the bank to get pre-approval for a mortgage. Backwards in the MSP space, right? You want to know that they're first you're dealing with a qualified buyer. And these search funds who go around looking for a deal so they can then go and find the appropriate funding to go fund the deal, that can be, I'm not going to say you shouldn't do that, but you should be very cautious about those types because you may find yourself talking to a firm that seems really polished, really clean, respectable. They present themselves well. You think, wow, this is awesome. They're paying all this attention to me. They don't actually have any money and they don't actually have anything in process. All they are is one, maybe two individuals looking for an opportunity. And not saying that anything bad could happen from that or something, good couldn't happen. It can. You just want to be a little bit careful and just know what you're dealing with before you get too far involved. We've talked about institutional investors like private equity firms, search engine, search funds, and the like. And there's an increasing number of those types out there. Just be cautious, be knowledgeable about who is approaching you, and especially be aware of them, just kind of plumbing for information, just repetitively asking you for information, signing you up to an NDA, but wanting all your financials, wanting to know your customer lists, wanting to know how you do things if you're in a vertical market or whatever. Just be cautious. What's another type of MSP buyer? Well, other MSPs. Other MSPs have been, MSPs have been buying MSPs for decades. It's not going to change. And the same rules apply when dealing with another MSP, but there are some pros and cons there that we should probably talk about. Number one, if you're dealing with a legitimate MSP, there is one really big upside, which is they probably know your business and know your profession as well as you do. And that's a good thing because you don't really have to worry about explaining to them how an MSP operates. You don't have to really explain to them what the risks of managed services are because they understand it. It's what they do as well. Now, you may have a different approach to doing things. You may have a different service vertical or market vertical, and that's fine. And they may be very curious about that. And that may be one of the attractive selling points that you present to them because maybe they don't have access to that type of service or market vertical, and that's why they are looking at you for an acquisition. And that could be the same for a merger as well. But you have a familiarity because you're both in the same profession. The risk, the downside is that they know all the ins and outs, right? Just like you do, right? So they may be a potential competitor, right? If they're looking to get into a new market, if they're looking to get into a new service offering, you want to be a little bit more cautious when dealing with that type of a buyer and, take things a little bit more carefully than you would, let's say, an institutional investor who is not currently running a managed services business, nor do they own a current managed services business. You have other options, however, and I want to get to some of those right now. And I have seen some of these actively work in the last probably year or two. And I'll give you one example. There was an MSP who, very well run MSP, not small, a good sized MSP, who had one partner who was transitioning out, and the one partner didn't want to leave yet. Wasn't his time, said, no, I'm still having fun. I still got some gas left in the engine. I don't want to go anywhere. But the partner wanted out. That has been a very common scenario for a lot of MSPs that I've seen over the years. And more often than not, I have to say, one partner wanting to leave can often trigger a forced sale of the entire company that is contentious and leads to many other problems and hurt feelings, because you may be dealing with one or multiple partners who say, I don't really want to leave, but this other partner is kind of forcing the sale. And in this one instance that I just talked about, the one partner who wanted to stay arranged for a liquidity event for his partner without having to exit himself. And it didn't involve private equity. At least I don't think so. And it kind of followed a track of how many professional services firms like accountants, doctors, lawyers handle departing, retiring, whatever partners who leave the firm and want to have a cash out, a liquidity event of their own, but they don't want to put the whole firm in jeopardy and force a sale in order to effectuate the succession plan of that one partner that wants to leave. And so I think that MSPs ought to be very aware of that opportunity and say to yourself, do I really need and do I really want to sell the entire company just because one partner, even if it's a 50% partner, one partner wants to leave? Does that mean that the entire company has to go? It brings up a lot of risk. And if you can figure out a good valuation and a good payout model, and I'll get into some of the pros and cons of that in a moment, you can really have a lot more opportunity and a lot less stress. I won't say it's stress-free or absent of stress, but you can have a more stress-free option when you're dealing with a retiring partner. Let's go through some of those pros and cons right now. Some of the advantages of having a kind of a closed, where you're not going out to a institutional lender, unless it's like a bank, but you're not going to another investor to fund your company or to sell your company to. But what you're really saying is, let's say I'm going to go to a bank because my partner wants to retire and I want to make sure that I can pay off my partner. There's a number of ways, right? I just mentioned a couple. Right? You could go to a bank, you could go to a credit union, you could go to friends and family, you could borrow the money in a variety of different ways in order to help pay them off. Now, one thing that immediately comes to mind is when you're dealing with a retiring partner, I think, and I've seen this happen multiple times, where the partner knows the quality of the business and they know the quality, hopefully, of their other partners. And when you have a retiring partner say, you know what, I'm okay with getting a payout, a partner getting a 5, 10, 15, 20-year payout, almost like a pension plan, like from companies and what they used to do decades ago. If they're getting that type of a payout because they know the quality of the business, it's run well, they know that the business isn't going to go anywhere, that can give so many different opportunities for the business to grow, to not be put into any financial turmoil because they had to go into deep debt. And it gives some immense flexibility to the operating capital and to be able to say, go retire, and the company stays in really solid, solvent position. Now, there's risk, right? Don't get me wrong. There's risk with everything, but there's a lot less risk, in my opinion, with doing a deal like that, where you have the company stay the same. You have a change in your ownership. Your cap table is going to change a little bit, but you deal with things kind of more internally, and you don't have to go out to private equity. You don't have to go out to those types and see them come in and say, okay, I'm going to give you this money to exit this one partner, but you're going to get me as a new partner instead. And you could see where that would be a little bit problematic for an MSP owner who wants to stay, and they're changing out a partner they do know for a partner they don't know. And especially if you're dealing with a private equity partner who doesn't understand managed services, that's a lot of risk. You could see why that would be kind of problematic for a business owner. So be aware of what I'll call non-traditional liquidity event funding sources and options for dealing with succession planning. Now, you may not have a person that just wants to retire. You may have people who just say, look, I'm sick of doing this. Maybe you're saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go do something else, and a career change. Maybe you have kids and you want kids to take over, but you don't want to give up the company. You want to have a succession plan where they get to earn their way into the business, but you still want to have a foot in the door in terms of ownership and be able to still call it your own. I think that those opportunities, I'm seeing more and more of those. There was another company, another MSP, who had a similar liquidity event or succession plan scenario that hit them. They had one partner that wanted out, wanted to retire, and the other partner had a relative, had a son who wanted into the business. And so it was very difficult to get the son to come into the business without the other partner leaving and freeing up some of that equity, right? So in that way, it worked very nicely. So the retiring partner left, the son of the remaining business owner comes into the MSP practice, buys and earns their way in slowly over time. But as they're earning into the business, they're also cashing out the retiring partner. And those types, again, I think that those are fantastic. Everybody wins types of scenarios because, again, it's not that they're not without risk, but it's that they have a much lower risk threshold, in my opinion, than dealing with a sale of 100% of your capital to a strange, unknown private equity firm, unless you're like one of those others that I talked about at the beginning of this podcast, where they're a fairly known entity, they have the cash, they've been doing deals, everybody knows who they are. It gives you options, right? More options, the better. Let's talk about internal employees, right? I have also seen an incredible growth as managed services has evolved and matured over the years. I have seen a number of scenarios where the MSPs wanting to have a liquidity or succession plan for any number of their current investors and owners. Not all investors or owners in the company are operators. They could be passive investors. We've seen that commonly where they don't actually run the MSP. They just invested very early on and they still are on the cap table, and there's new people in the company that want to buy in. It's a good thriving MSP practice, but they got these legacy investors who they got to get them out, right? Somehow. Those are legitimate succession planning issues that many MSPs today are dealing with. More MSPs are dealing with every day. So let's talk about that, because whether you turn your company into an ESOP, for those of you in the United States, you know what that is, an employee-owned company. They have different versions of that throughout the world if you're in a non-US geographic location. But there are many scenarios where you would have a internal employee who is not a business owner, not an equity owner in the company, who presents themselves as a legitimate candidate for equity ownership, and you want to free up space. So that type of scenario is more likely than you may realize, and it doesn't always have to involve a private equity deal. And if more MSPs realize that, I think that we would be in a far better position than we are even today, because it's less risky, a little bit easier, still challenging, but a little easier. And you're dealing with more known factors than unknown factors, especially when dealing with a third party, unknown investor group who you just met at a conference and they're saying, hey, we want to buy your MSP. We're going to pay you all this money and things are going to be great. You're going to be retired. You're going to live on a boat, blah, blah, blah. When that begins to fade and you get down to the practical discussions of how is it going to work, you may find that dealing with internal family, employees, partners, and maybe a traditional funding source like a bank or a credit union might just give you more safer options that are more appealing to you than a traditional funding source like a private equity or venture capital group. Let's talk about valuation. In all of these scenarios, you're going to come to a moment where you have to have a valuation discussion. You have to have an understanding of, what do I, as a seller, think my MSP business is worth? And what do I reasonably think that this buyer or this investor is going to think my MSP practice is worth? Now, for a private equity group that's doing a MSP roll up, the good news is they're going to have a really hyper accurate understanding of what they think your MSP practice is worth. Doesn't mean you're going to agree with it, but they're going to have a really solid understanding. And they're going to tell you, we're going to value you based off of, maybe it's EBITDA. Maybe it's going to be a multiplier of EBITDA. Maybe it's going to be a multiplier of your managed services recurring revenue. Maybe it's going to be a combination of that, of EBITDA and managed services recurring revenue, and maybe a few other things. They'll probably tell you very quickly, and they'll probably tell you, this is what the calculus is, and this is what we're going to pay you. And then comes the fun part of, this is how we're going to pay you. And I don't want to spend too much time, because it would take a ton of time, more time than we have today, to talk about funding structures. What I mean by that, funding structures are they going to pay you all in cash? If you're lucky, yeah. If you're a bigger deal, if you are a deal that involves a little bit more complexity, they're going to pay you cash, but not all cash. They may pay you cash. They may pay you in a note. They may pay you a promissory note that gets paid out on condition of you performing certain things. You have to be cautious of those, because what do they want you to perform? How long do you have to perform it? Are they going to give you the tools to perform and be successful? Or are they going to use those performance metrics as a way to get out of paying you? One of those risks that we talked about. They may even say, you know what, we're going to pay you a little bit in cash, but we're going to pay you a big chunk of your payment in newco equity. What does that mean? Well, they'll actually sell you your own company through new equity in this new entity, right? Because they're going to buy you, they're going to put you into this newco, whatever that's called, and sell you part of your payment in the form of maybe 10% equity in the new entity. So there are many of those different structures and tips and tricks that investors have to pay you out. You have to be aware of them, understand not just what is your valuation, but understand what's the realistic likelihood that you're going to get paid, and how are you going to get paid, and when are you going to get paid. All of those things you have to think about. Those issues get a little bit easier, like I said, when you're dealing with friends, family, and partners that know and trust one another, or at least know one another and know how you operate. It doesn't mean that you can't still employ some of those same tactics, but like I said, it's something that you have to be aware of, is not just the value of the company, but how are you going to get paid? What's the structure of those payments, in what form, and are you happy with those? So how do you get a valuation? You could do it a number of ways. Typically, if the buyer is going to approach you, they're going to give you a letter of intent or some sort of indication and document that says, I'm going to pay you X number of dollars for your company. And it's going to be based on this method or this calculus. And they'll tell you what the calculus is in the letter of intent, typically. Then you'll probably have a finite amount of time before they want you to sign the agreement, but you'll have to be, acting very quickly and find your own method to say, okay, is this what I agree with? Do I like this or not? Those types of deals almost always go better if you have someone representing you. If you're dealing with what I talked about earlier and you're having more of a friends and family succession plan strategy, you have a lot more flexibility. It doesn't mean that you still don't have to do all these elements, because you do. You're still going to have to go get a valuation for the company. But you have a little bit more breathing room, some more flexibility when you're dealing with people that you already know, because then you can say, look, we're going to go hire this firm over here and we're going to have them do a valuation on our MSP practice. And we're all going to agree that they are going to come up with a number and we're all going to agree to it. We're not going to squabble. We're not going to say they're wrong. We're going to accept valuation. And that's kind of a above the table, transparent. Everything is right out there. And you say, oh, that's the model we're going to use for a succession plan for an equity partner or who wants to leave, or a soon to be equity partner, someone who wants to come into the company, right? Everybody knows the rules before the game starts. So where does that leave you today? There are a number of opportunities, as I said before. Don't feel pressure just because you go to an MSP conference and some guy with a nice slick suit or a polished, business card comes up to you and says, "Hey, do you ever think about selling your business? Call me if you're interested." Do your due diligence. Find out who they are, find out what firm they're with, and ask a ton of questions before you start to divulge your time and your information about your company. It may be worth it for you to just hit the pause button and say, look, I'm going to control the cadence of this relationship. And before I start to sign an NDA with you, and before we get too far down this path, ask questions. How many deals have you done? Do you have money? Can you prove it? Let's see it. Will you be able to prove it when we sign an NDA? What do you want from this company? Have you ever run an MSP business before? Do you want me to stay? Do you want me to leave? Do you want my key people to stay? Do you want them to leave? All of those questions are going to have very different answers depending on who you're talking to, who has approached you. If you ever feel like it's getting out of control, if you ever feel like they're just a little bit too slippery with their answers and they're just not really giving you the warm and fuzzies, walk away. Don't be afraid to just say, look, I'm not really ready right now. MSPs that I know who have gone into this process, they know that they want out. They know that they want to do something else, right? There have been MSPs who love being an MSP, but they love being a technical person, and they don't love being a business owner and all the headache that goes with it, the paperwork, the administrative stuff. That's the stuff they don't like. So they look for a sale. They look for a deal where they can do what they love to do and not have the headache of being a business owner. I get it. I really do get it. But they go out and they look for and find the right partner, and then they're the ones in charge of the tempo, the cadence, who they're talking to, who they're not talking to, and they run the process largely on their own terms. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that process and that approach. If you are one of those previously mentioned examples where you're dealing with someone in your firm and maybe it's a partner who they want out for whatever reason, or maybe you want them out and you want to buy them out, but you don't want to have to be forced into a sale of the entire company in order to do that, there are ways for you to do that. There are absolutely ways that you can do that. And don't be afraid to think about alternatives to succession planning that you may be familiar with, that you may go to a conference and hear a bunch of people say, "Oh, we sold to this roll-up company and life is great. And, we're drinking caviar and, eating caviar, drinking champagne and living life," right? Okay, maybe that's true, but maybe that's not for you. Maybe that's not exactly what you're looking for. Don't be afraid to explore alternatives, because there are tons of alternatives out there. That is the entire point of this whole episode, is that there are opportunities that work. They are working now. We are seeing them work across MSPs of so many different types of MSP profiles and different size MSP firms. It does work. It can work. And that, I think, is just an amazing facet of this thing that we call managed services that never ceases to amaze me, is that we are now 4 decades into the managed services profession, and interest has never been higher for people who want to own, run, or invest in managed services. That's a good thing, and we hope that never stops. Until next time.